to Still Journeying. I'm Steven. This show was born out of a desire to gather some of my closest co-laborers in the faith, to talk, reflect, and share stories from our journeys into and out of different church contexts. The name Still Journeying is a play on the biblical idea of sojourning, being people in motion, not yet home, but faithfully walking with God through the tension. That's something many of us in the Asian American Christian community know intimately, navigating inherited traditions, modern faith, and generational change. These first 3 episodes are a pilot. Depending on how it resonates, I may continue with more. For now, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hey everyone, we're here with episode 3. Today's topic is going to be mostly around some of the themes that we talked about last episode with Asian American ministry, but now we're transitioning towards the idea of being an Asian American male, in particular a husband. Why this topic, you might ask? Well, again, it is May 23rd, 2025, and I'm getting married tomorrow, so this is my last attempt to get some advice before I actually need to become a husband. So I get to become a husband. I think the first question I would open up with everybody is actually one specific to a lot of what I've heard growing up, which is that in the American lens, Asian Americans are sort of seen as the least masculine in general. And I'm kind of wondering, do people here think that that's true? And if so, why or why not? Or why do you think we're perceived as sort of the least masculine group in regards to being Asian American men?
I mean, I think from the Western eye or from the American lens, I think it's pretty obvious that Asian men were the bottom of the totem pole, at least for me growing up. I think K-pop has given us a little bit of an edge up in recent days. Yes. I've heard that, at least from my high school boys, that they're a little bit more desirable nowadays. But at least for me, I did not experience any of that. So, yeah, there's a acronym called SPAM, Shy Passive Asian Male, right? I think that kind of vibe or energy was very prevalent, at least in my high school when I was, kind of discovering what it meant to be a man. So, yeah, I would agree with that sentiment.
Yeah, I remember sort of just the spam analogy. Maybe it's a Chinese church thing. The 3 Chinese people are nodding their heads to it. But I also just feel like because of the culture we were raised up in of like being a good kid who got good grades, and at least for me, my parents didn't care if I was like the most bland personality on earth. They just cared that I was getting into a good school, getting a good job, getting a good career. So I don't think I was really asked to or really told to develop any sorts of like of my own unique like passions or interests, nor have like a drive for myself. It was sort of like an obedience based way of living, right? So that formed sort of the spam analogy of like, oh, like being a good son is being passive and listening and all that stuff. And my parents would even like, that classic Asian parent thing where they compare you. It's like, oh, be like that kid who's like doing calculus at 6 years old or something like that. And I'm just like, yeah, but I talked to him the other day and he had the personality of a dry potato flake. Like he just was so horrible to talk to. And I think for better or for worse, like I was never going to be that personality, but I know like my parents would have liked it if I was more that probably growing up. I don't know how they feel about it now, but definitely I think that's part of the culture in terms of how parents think their kids should behave, and that might result in some of this. So I agree with you on that overall.
What's interesting to me is before we get into, maybe masculinity, I think Asians are just generalized as being more submissive and passive in general, like regardless of gender. And I think now when you zoom in on like men and husbands, like, I don't know. I feel like particularly for me, I don't know if I've ever like was explicitly challenged in that area. of not feeling like a man per se. But I think in general, like I felt the stereotype of just being, oh, like Asians in general, like they won't speak up, like they won't, you know, yeah, they're not really, outspoken, or they won't really be assertive. And maybe that did play a role in like how I wanted to be just within my community, because it was not as diverse. But yeah, I think that was just something, just like in terms of stereotypes, that was definitely like a really big thing that I think I personally like experienced and have been like thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, even as a kid, when I think about like TV shows or movie, like I don't quite remember, seeing like an Asian male lead saving the world, right? They're like the sidekick, like the text were like when the main character would call them and be like, "Yo, what's the status of the report?" And then the Asian character's like, "Well, according to my calculation," or like something like that, And then Dragon Ball Z, and we're like, "Oh, Goku is our Superman," That was so cool. And then I mean Shang-Chi, that was right. So I do think nowadays, kind of like what Austin mentioned too, like through K-pop, like BTS, I do think even just Asian males are getting more confident in who they are. But man, when I was a kid, seriously, like I don't really remember a character outside of like Korean media or an anime where like an Asian male was like, wow, he's so cool. He's saving the world, and I'm so proud to be an Asian male. I don't think I really experienced that in like American media.
I think learning a lot about Asian American history, because I've had to do this with my ministry training and stuff like that. I started realizing some of the roots of this. So for Chinese Americans in particular, when the men came to work on the railroads, they were put into they were put to do certain things, and two of those things were considered women's work. One was cooking, and the other is laundry. And so those are the two businesses that Chinese Americans became good at and became the stereotypical Chinese American business. And so that has affected the way that whites see Asian Americans in general, is that, oh, they do women's work. And they're good at it, and they're willing to do it submissively. And so that has affected us, and I think we internalize it sometimes, where we say, okay, maybe I shouldn't speak up here, or stuff like that. We're in the marketplace, the workplace. So I think that's a big part of that.
Yeah, I think because of the lack of Asian Americans to identify with in like pop culture, I really identified with Asian Americans in subcultures. And so like my celebrity crush was Doublelift, who is like this professional League of Legends player. Like I still follow him to like this day, and like nobody knows who that is, who doesn't play League of Legends, but like a huge population of the Asian American community plays that game, right? And so there were small avenues for you to feel like you could be like alpha. Because if you look at Doublelift, he looks like me in high school. Like he had dandruff in his hair, like he clearly didn't take care of himself, and when he spoke to women, it was atrocious. But he had that dog in him, when he played games. And he was alpha in that sense, right? And so, like, that's all I got,
Wait, you like Doublelift more than Faker?
Doublelift's Asian American. I'm not Korean, bro.
All right. Fair.
So speaking of it as an outsider, right? The perception that I had of Asian people was related to sports. It's like you don't see any Asians playing football or basketball or being super good at soccer. Like they're good at like baseball and golf because those are non-contact, right? So there's this sense of like weakness. They're like good with technique stuff, but they can't get physical. And they're shorter than the rest of us, like that sort of thing. So just this overall kind of sense of like weakness. They're not as physically dominant. And I think that kind of translated over. It's interesting to hear you talk about the railroad stuff with cooking and laundry, but I always thought it was like, oh, they're too weak to take initiative was sort of like the vibe that I got as an outsider. But I remember Linsanity. Like, do you guys remember Linsanity? Like how
Of course.
cool of a big thing that was like. So like that was just like a really big deal. Even as an outsider, that felt like a massive deal. It was like, oh, here's this Asian guy taking over the NBA for a period of time.
Good thoughts. I'm curious. We kind of talked about it from a cultural perspective, and last episode we talked a bit about how culture plays into how we even just are believers, right? So with all of that, how do you think that's affected the men in the Asian American church? / what do you think it is to be a good man, husband, male authority in these sort of contexts? Or perhaps, how do you think it affected things negatively?
I've got lots of thoughts. Me too. All right. So I think the passivity and like the risk averseness that you see in Asian culture is not very prevalent in the actual immigrants themselves. If you look at our parents and our parents' generation, they took massive risk and they took massive initiative, you know. And yet their children very rarely take those radical steps. And one way you can really see this is in missions, right? If you look at which congregations are producing missionaries in the Asian American church, it's generally like the Chinese congregations or the Korean congregations that are sending missionaries to these crazy places. How many Asian American missionaries do you meet? Not that many. And the ones that you do meet, they're not going to Afghanistan. They don't have a heart for North Korea, you know. Yet, you know, many, you know, Korean like immigrants or people who are born in Korea, they're willing to go to those places. They're willing to take that crazy initiative, and they are not risk averse like we are. And I think a big reason why Asian Americans are so risk averse is our parents took risks so that we wouldn't have to. And I think we've embodied a lot of that. And I think that's oftentimes to our detriment.
Yeah, I think I have also a lot to say about how it affected Asian American Christianity, especially for men. So, Austin, I think that's a really interesting perspective, your take on missionary. And for me, I want to take on the church perspective. So, yeah, we do feel like there is a lack of quote unquote masculinity within the Asian male. So what happens is in an Asian American church, all these Asian male feel empowered for the first time, right? They are not the minority, like they're part of the majority. And so what happens is like serving in a church makes you feel empowered. Like you're in a position of power, and you can build your reputation, you can build your influence. Like you can finally do the things you really couldn't, out in the open world. And especially within Korean American Christianity, pastors in Korean churches, I think it has gotten a lot better now, but man, they were like gods in church, and you can gain so much by becoming a pastor in a Korean church, like specifically just the way the congregation fear you, the way the congregation treats you. And it made especially Korean American men want to serve in a church, but for the wrong reasons. And it created such a toxic understanding of faith, just not the most complete picture of what it means to serve God faithfully. But yeah, so I mean, those are the negative parts. But I would say though, in another sense, it did drive like men in general to want to serve in the church again, because it made them feel empowered, more of a man, than otherwise they could, outside of the church context.
Shout out to Off the Pulpit. I listen to it pretty frequently. There was one episode they talked about Korean leadership and sort of like, I think they use this, it might be slightly off, but the example is almost like if you're like a janitor, if your day job 5 days a week is just bowing and saying yes to everybody, and then at church, you're like a lay leader, that is your time of the week where you get to sort of show any resemblance of authority over other people. So if I'm like an immigrant dad who moved over here to set up my kid for a good life, 5 days of the week, I'm sitting there bowing my head for like 40 hours. And then I finally get to have any sense of like perhaps honor in church and at home. And that can be a good thing, and that can also be a bad thing, right? And we've all, I think, heard of different stories of authority abusing their positions and all of that. And oftentimes I think it does come from this idea of like being an authority figure is glorious in this like dynamic that we've sort of grown up in. And as a result, people are pursuing it in different forms. They're pursuing, honestly, to be frank, like worship of themselves because they feel themselves just being put down in the positions that they're in because they took risks, right? And they shouldered these burdens for their children, for us, right? Here, who really just had to sort of be invisible to it. They wouldn't show it. Or maybe they would show it because they took their frustrations out on us when they got home in one way or another. And that cycle, I think, really created this weirdness where it's like, okay, well, I'm passive 40 hours a week, but when I get home, I'm going to yell at my kids and they're going to become passive as well because I am their authority figure who's yelling at them to obey me because no one obeys me outside of these people. And that cycle of sort of this, to the point of what we talked about last time, the honor-shame dynamic is almost cyclical. When you feel that you don't have face, when you feel like you are being in a shameful presence, then you kind of want to force yourself into a place where you're honored. You grasp at that straw yourself, and it can look twisted and it can look broken, and it can cause a lot of hurt in and outside of the church. So I think we've talked about this a bit. My question then, I guess, for everybody is, what do we think when you think of your parents, the immigrant parent generation, what do you think, to Austin's point, was like what they thought being a man was? And how much of that do you think has changed for our generation, for the good or the worse?
So I have ancestors in my family that go back to the 1860s in America. So what the cycle was that men would come to America to work and send money back. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't until my parents' generation that actually children and wives came to America. So if you're seeing what's happening, they were in China or Hong Kong, and they would come to America, work, provide for their families, send money back, but not be home. So I come from a whole long line of absent fathers. So on one hand, what the value is that as a man provides for his family. On the other hand, it's also, there's no expectation for the man to be present relationally. And so to the point where, like, my dad didn't grow up with his dad. Like, he didn't know how to be a dad. Like, knew how to be a father, but didn't know how to be a dad. And so I make that distinction because we had a challenging relationship growing up. And so even now, when I get home from work, and we homeschool, I get home from work, I'm tempted to disengage because I'm introvert, right? So I've been dealing with people all day. So I'm like, I didn't need a rest from people. But I realize there's a temptation for me to disengage with people, and I'm not saving my best for my kids. And so I want to make sure that I'm not the absent father that like generations of my family grew up with. And so, yeah, I'm providing for my family, but sometimes I get the opportunity to do extra, like teach extra classes, for example, for more compensation, and I have to say, no, I don't want that. I'd rather have more time at home. And so, so being a man is both providing for the family, but also being there relationally.
I feel like there's a similar pattern that I had growing up. I sometimes forget about this. I low-key like literally forget it. But like when I was in like elementary school, I don't remember exactly for how long, but my dad would work out in like Milwaukee or somewhere up in Wisconsin, and he would come back home for the weekends. So I didn't see him like 5 days of the week because he was just like out working up north in like an hour and a half or hour commute or something like that. And then he would come back to our house for the weekends. And I just grew up very independent in that sense. My parents let me walk to school by myself from like second grade onward, which I don't know, nowadays is kind of like seen as apparently taboo. I don't know, but at least like it kind of also affected, to your point, the relationship I had with my dad, because I didn't have a lot of time with him. When I was with him, he didn't seem that interested in me because he was the introvert and the quiet one. My mom was loud and bunctious, like always coming to hug me one. And then that sort of resulted in us having a strained relationship as well when I was in middle school. And you're kind of getting at this point of almost like the generational sin that might have spring out of this culture, that because of the expectations that are kind of placed upon the people, that there's these ways that we have to almost understand that what they did had its use and its good, but we also want to like break chains and bondage and damage that was done there. And even for myself, it's like one of the first actually like things I realized was different about Sonia's family was they don't take their phones out during mealtime. And I always had phones out during mealtime. It was like a habit that was just ingrained into me. So when I was eating lunch with her, I think maybe like a couple months into dating, she was just like, why do you have your phone out all the time? And I'm like, what do you mean? And then she and I had to like have a conversation about not having phones out. And you know what? I think it's better to not have phones out. Like I fully buy into that. But I realized, like, it made me think. And then I started going to gatherings and people had their phones out during mealtime. And I noticed it. And then I went to these like other people's places or these hang out with my friends, and everybody would just like be disconnected. And that was like almost like the temperature in the room. And it was sort of this thing that had been accepted or seen as commonplace. And I think that had been just one small example of like how this small thing sort of affected the way that our lives started like meshing together when we started spending more and more time together.
I think for my dad, I think his sense of worth was very attached to his fulfilling of his duties. And like my dad is very dutiful, you know, and very faithful to the things that are expected of him or that have been given to him. And so, like for example, like with my mom, he was so faithful despite all of the difficulties through the mental health ups and downs, right? But one of the times I really saw him like struggle as a man was when we moved to Chicago in like 2006-07. Financial crisis hits. We just bought a house. He gets laid off. And like I see my dad like withering as a man each day that he cannot find work. Like it's as if his value as a human being is like disintegrating, you know, because his sense of duty is like that strong, you know. And then when he finds a job, it's like, oh, finally, you know. Even at church, right? Like my dad has been an elder at my church for many, many, many years, and his like sense of duty to that is like very, very strong, you know. And I think that honestly set a really good example to me of what faithfulness really looks like, despite the fact that we didn't have that like interpersonal connection, you know. I had to find that elsewhere. I had, older men in my life who discipled me and all that, and I'm really thankful for that. I mean, I wish that was my dad, but you know, can't have everything in life. But yeah, that sense of faithfulness and dutifulness, I think, really encompassed his sense of masculinity.
When I think about the one generation above us, like our parents, including my dad, I would say, yeah, like the things many of you guys mentioned about their duty to provide for the family was one of the most defining thing about being a dad, making sure that we had roof over our head and making sure that we had food to eat every day. And then next came like pushing your children so they could have a better life. Again, like emphasizing excellence, emphasizing performance. But they really did that because they loved us, right? Like they really thought that this is the best way to raise my kid so he has a shot at living a good and fulfilling life, especially here in America, the American dream. But then what that lacked was the emotional connection, as Professor Daniel talked about, the relational aspect. And like we joke like, oh, Asian dads, have a emotional intelligence of a brick, like. Like, is it a joke though? Is it a joke though? I mean, that's a thing, right? Like we laugh because it's not far from the truth. I mean, I love my dad, and I think again the way he provided for the family, and even now it has gotten much better, like our emotional connection. But I would say it wasn't really that present in my younger days. But that does make me wonder. I do think our generation is now going to react to that generation as if their shortcoming, as long as we make up for their shortcoming, we're going to be a good dad. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hyper focus on emotional connection, affirmation, right? Because when we were younger, we're always told to do better, right? If we got A minus, we're told to get A. If we got an A, we're told to get A plus. But because we experienced so much hurt from that kind of childhood, I do wonder in our reaction how opposite we're going to go from that. Like again, there is nothing wrong with parents wanting their child to truly give their best and live out to their full potential. But now they were so focused on, okay, to not to be like my parents who hurt me in this way, I'm going to again just really focus on affirming my children, just really focus on creating a relational, emotional bond that's less about authoritative power dynamic, but about that friendship bond that I really crave. And I think once we do that, we will have our own unique blind spots that's unfortunately going to hurt the next generation, right? So I think that is something that kind of crossed my mind as we're talking about this.
Man, I feel like I'm just sitting here in silence because honestly, like I grew up with such a very unique upbringing. Like my biological dad passed away when I was 2. I had a stepdad who was basically like not really that present, and he passed away in middle school. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my life, like there was actually kind of a big, kind of a big hole in terms of like a father figure. In a lot of ways, I reflect on it, and it's like, in a lot of ways, like, oh, it's kind of it was like a blank slate where maybe I didn't have a lot of negative experiences from either like a critical or even like a abusive father. But I think just hearing what everybody is like sharing, like first kind of makes me like a little like sad in some ways, to be honest, be like, oh man, like, I think that I just feel like I'm coming from a place of lack of experience. Like, oh, like you all are coming from places where you've been able to see like an example for like many years, whether it's good or bad, right? You be able to glean from that. So I've been asking myself this entire time, this question is like, all right, like God, what are you leading me to? And like, I think one of the things that's been cool about my experience is I've genuinely felt this way. There are times where I feel bitter. I'm like, man, I see other kids playing catch with their dads and like didn't have that. But I genuinely have felt growing up like so thankful that I think the concept of God being my father, my heavenly father, has been like just like so overwhelming to me. And in a lot of ways, I see that as a blessing that I've been able to have that example versus, I've just heard countless stories, and even within my family, just seeing fathers like, like creating a lot of trauma, things like that too. So that's like one thing that I've just been like meditating on in this conversation. But I think another thing is just appreciation to be a part of my wife's family. And even though it's only been like 10 or so years, just seeing him as a, a believing man, as a husband, as a father, it's been really awesome for me to just see, yeah, like how he has just been a foundation and a provider in a different way than I've just seen conceptually. Like I really resonated with the stories about like how, in a lot of Asian American families, like the father is just a provider, like financially. But I see my father-in-law, he's not only a provider financially, but man, he actually enjoys things with his kids, like sports, Mariners, like my wife has just been indoctrinated since literally a kid, and I think that that is such a special connection where he was not absent. He was so present. And that's been awesome. Really, really awesome to see. Yeah.
Yeah. So my story is more in line with Danny's of father wasn't really there. I mentioned in a previous episode how I would just go for the summer to visit. So like I would see him and live with him for 1 month out of a year, all from mandatory education, like through high school. And so, and especially when I was in elementary school, I was very fearful of him. Like it wasn't necessarily an enjoyable experience to go and visit. But there was the sense of provision echoing that. Even though he was in New York, he would always send a check to my mom every month to help provide. And like, there was no alimony attached to that. They were never married. He just did that of his own, sense of responsibility for me. And so I think that, subconsciously that played into the way I viewed God as well. It's like God is this faraway person who will always provide, but he's not really that close to you. And when you get close, he's scary. And so, and then just with my grandfather who was there, who was kind of the male figure, he was always working so hard. And I know that had to do again with provision, but that also meant he was not there. And when he was there, he was pretty ass. He was like resting, Yeah. So I guess that maybe this is just like an immigrant parent thing. It's not Asian or Latin, Yeah. And so I think that left me. Well, I'll come back to manhood in a second. Like, cause honestly, the bigger impact it had on me was like hard work is not worth it. Like that was the first lesson I took from just growing up, is like, don't work so hard that you leave everyone else behind. It's just not worth the trouble. But then in terms of thinking about like manhood and being a husband, it created this sense of like, well, marriage is like mostly contractual. Like the husband's part of the contract is to provide for the family and protect the family, like make sure everyone is safe and healthy. And then the mom's part of the contract is to build everyone up and like support, especially the husband, almost like serve him, sort of thing. And even to serve the children too, in a sense. Yeah. So I don't think I've had super healthy marriages to look at all. And then super healthy examples of manhood. And I have a lot of respect for my father and my grandfather, particularly in their faith and the way they pursue the Lord, which is kind of ironic. That there's such struggles as fathers in their families, but they're men of God. But yeah, that's what.
That was good. I think everybody has kind of shared about the previous generation and the good and the bad that came with it. I'm gonna float this personal interpretation I've made on the current generation / next generation. My opinion is that, and we can probably spend the rest of our time here, is that there are sort of two buckets of people that almost I would say are like bipartisan in terms of how they internalize manhood. The first is the one who sort of just passed on exactly what was given to them, and they're sort of just doing the exact same thing. They haven't thought too much about manhood, what it means to be a man, and they're just kind of living in this like, I'll do the provide for the family or be responsible or whatever I'm supposed to sort of mindset. And then there's a second group that has sort of woken up to the brokenness of, and Daniel, you mentioned this earlier, they woke up to the brokenness of the previous generation and are almost doing this overcorrection in the opposite direction, where they are now very much in like the emotionally healthy camp. They're maybe even going to therapy and they're doing all this stuff, but then they are not necessarily honoring any of the intentions of that previous generation, slash maybe there are deficiencies there. And I think those are the two majority parties I kind of see. And then I think there's this question that remains, which is, what is God's desire in your opinion, slash, from what you can tell, what do you think it means to sort of balance the weight of our experiences as the new generation, looking at the previous generation and trying to be men, husbands, fathers, albeit very, well, only one of us here has experience with all of those, but just like as a man called to exemplify God's character, what do you think that means for this generation, and what does it need to do, or what has it done maybe?
So I was a teacher for 3 years before I did ministry. And every now and then I would see situations where students would just talk back to their parents and like control the dynamic. And I was just like, whoa, what is happening there? And I think the parents are trying not to like stifle the children, like not to stifle their voice. But I think like it's like a swing too far on the other side. I was like, bro, your child should not be telling you what to do. And I think with the Lord, I think with us, there is this balance of holiness and mercy, right? Like you need to be holy as I am holy, but also there is my grace is sufficient for you. So I really think that parents should be striving to strike that balance, right? Like the child should be obedient and like trying to follow what the parent is saying, but the parent should also be gracious and merciful and compassionate in the midst of all of that. And I'm sure striking that balance is very difficult. But I fear that too many parents in like just trying to protect their children from like feeling like they're nothing, or like trying to feel like they have no voice, are just giving them so much leeway. Like children need direction. Like they don't have the experience in life and the knowledge to like live well on their own. You do need to put boundaries and rules, things in place to help guide them going forward.
I've heard this framework, another off the pulpit mention again, but when they talked about sort of this brokenness that occurs with people sort of domineering outside of, or men who are domineering in authority, and they kind of end up in these scandals or brokennesses, they kind of chalked it up to this idea of not having ever mastered the self. And when you haven't mastered yourself, what they basically said was you can't master your house. You can't master and have ownership over that responsibility. You need to first master yourself. And I think a lot of what I'm seeing is sort of just over corrections or under corrections based off of this lack of discipline over what God has given us to steward, which includes our lives, our bodies, our hearts, our attitudes, as well as households, all these other things that we have in front of us in terms of ministries. And a lot of the brokenness for men, I think, begins, and I don't know if ends yet, I would say, but I would say it starts with understanding how we are called to steward our own flesh and sort of discipline our own body, right? And I think that idea has sort of been either ignore your flesh and your bodily needs and just overwork yourself till you collapse, or really tune into it and submit to it almost, and just like let your flesh and your needs rule over you. And neither of those are mastering it. Neither of those are actually understanding it and actually ruling over it. That's just one thing I've heard that I've been brewing on, I guess.
So two things that I'm hearing from you, Stephen. One is self-awareness and understanding yourself well. I don't think I understood myself well at all until I started getting counseling and realizing, oh, I tend to do that when this happens, or I have a family history of this. And then stepping back and saying, okay, this is my experience, this is my culture, this is my upbringing. Let me think critically about it now. That's a good thing. That one I think I need to work on. And so, so two things then, self-awareness and thinking critically. And I think that we can't really move forward well without knowing who we are and how we can evaluate that.
I think the thought that comes to mind is, again, kind of relates to my experience. Is just like I was always, I guess, looking for that example. And I think as like men, like I think we truly crave just trying to see a role model, and that's one thing that I think for us, first being self-aware of who are you, and then also understanding like who do you want to be is really important. And I think that translates to me is like looking for those examples. First, yes, look to Christ and his example, and God the Father and his characteristics and his example, but really even like trying to look for the people within like your community. And I think that's something that I think for me, I've just naturally been doing all my life, is like really admiring certain like guys in my church, or like my coaches, or like, now my father-in-law. Yeah, it's been really interesting. And I think that's just like one thing that I feel like as a guy, I think that is specifically what I feel like God is like calling me to do, and has been just naturally leading me to do too.
I think as men, there's always going to be other men that we respect and esteem. And I think it's incredibly powerful when those men who we respect believe in us and show us that they think that we can be respectable the way that they are, And I think for us, as all leaders in our respective churches or ministries, I think something really powerful that we can do is to believe in this next generation of young men, and to find younger men to disciple and to show them that, like, I believe that you can be as great as you fear that you could never be, And I have another story, because I love to tell stories. There's this guy in my church, and he is your classic spam, like he's so awkward socially. He's so like he struggles to make eye contact. He mutters a lot, You probably met a guy like this in high school many times before. He's in our college ministry, and he has begun taking his faith like really seriously, and but he's still kind of like that. That's like his personality still. And then one time I was asked to fill in to run this like volleyball clinic for our church. And there was a bunch of people who are like ex-Christian who were at this clinic. And so I'm supposed to give like a little devotional before the clinic. And I was like kind of nervous, because all these people are church and they've decided to reject Jesus. And so like, what am I going to say to them about Jesus? So like, I'm in like the hallway right outside the gym, like thinking about like what I should say. And this guy, let's call him Alex, he sits next to me. He's like the hall monitor at the church, and so he gets paid to like just sit there basically. and I share with him what's going on, and then he's like, "Huh, Austin. So when Pastor Chris leads the basketball ministry, he usually says something from the Bible for his devotionals. You should try that." And I'm like, "Thanks, bro. Like, of course I'm gonna say something from the Bible, you know." And then I like write him off again, you know. And then so I like do my thing. I leave my devotional, and then we're like playing volleyball. And Alex is like on the sidelines, and I see him talking to this other kid. And this other kid is from Champaign, and I actually know him because I've tried to reach out to him in the past. But he's like super like intellectual atheist kind of energy. Like he'll like bring up the problem of evil and all this stuff. And like I was like, I don't know if intimidated was the right word, but I tried to like talk about Jesus with him, and it was like clear he wasn't interested, and I kind of like just gave up basically. And I saw Alex sitting next to him, and so I was like curious, like they were like in deep conversation. I was like, never seen him like this. And so I like walk over, and he's sharing the gospel with this guy. He's like the atheist guy is like basically talking about like the trolley problem, and like it's like going way over Alex's head, you know? And then he's like, "Well, what I think about good and evil is that like I know that God created the world, and he knows what is right and wrong, and that every single person we've done what is wrong in God's eyes, and that's why he sent Jesus, so that there would be a way to make right our relationship with God." And I was like shocked. I was like, how does he have more courage than me to share the gospel with this guy, you know? And that's when I realized that I'm like, I need to believe that God can do with what I think is a shy, passive Asian male, that he can do great and powerful things. That story about Gideon and the men who lap like dogs, like that is the story that comes to mind. And I think for us, especially for me, honestly, I hope that I can see beyond like the passivity, beyond the lack of initiative, beyond all the qualities that like these young Asian American men have, and really see and believe that like God can use them to do powerful, incredible things for his kingdom. Because if I don't, I'm missing out. I
have to cut things because of time, but I have one last thing, maybe one or two people. If someone was listening right now who feels like they failed as a man, whether it was in regards to lust or some sort of addictions, or they just don't see the potential in themselves, does anyone have words for them that they could hear right now? I'll go first. I think for the longest time, I thought that I had to prove competency to God. But I think one of the most shocking things for me is that God already has made me into his image, which means that if I stop trying to prove how I'm capable and I simply ask God to take me along for the ride that is life, and I submit to him and I follow him, he is shown to be faithful over and over and over again on delivering me out of things that I never thought I could have been out of, and giving me victory and developing me into a person that I never thought I could have been. Some of you know this. When I was a kid, I was like in the youth group, the troublemaker kid. And my youth pastor at our senior banquet said, "Steven's living proof that God can change anyone." And yes, you're allowed to laugh at that one, because I was such a troublemaker growing up. But like, God uses what is shameful to humble the proud. That's exactly right. Like what we go through in our own stories, when we start developing our faith, we think, oh, I kind of got it figured out. And then something like that happens with your story about Alex Austin. And for you who is listening and is just not feeling like you're capable of anything, God can do anything if you let him. And he's created all of us uniquely for a purpose, for his kingdom. So I think my encouragement is for you to open up that door for him.
I would say, I think when people feel like they failed as, even we talked about as a father or as a husband or just as a man, I think usually it stems from the fact that you let one character or very few characters define manhood in general. You let few characters define what it means to be a good husband, a good father, and just a man in general. But when we look at God, there's so many attributes that describes the character of God. God is known as a God who is gentle, God who is patient. And as we're talking about biblical manhood, especially because we're talking about passivity and shyness, it reminded me of Moses again, because Moses, his defining character that's clearly stated in the Bible is that he was the most meek man on earth. And if you look at the definition of meek, it actually is almost equivalent to being a pushover. And we would never say like, wow, there's a man right there because he's being so meek. But I think it's so important to think about just what does it mean to be a man of God? Someone who is like Christ, who bears the characters of God. I mean, there's just so many defining characteristics of God, where just because you failed in one aspect, just because you failed or you feel like you failed in one characteristic, does not mean it defines you as a failure. Like, it has nothing to do with your, again, identity. So I will just encourage the people who are feeling discouraged that truly there is so much more to becoming a man of God, being like Christ, than these few characters that we may seem to elevate or really let those characters define the manhood.
I think that does it. Thank you all for your thoughts. Hopefully that was helpful for everyone who is listening. I know for me, I'm going to be facing this, especially with this new title of husband, for the rest of my life. So why don't we do this? Can we just, I don't know who wants to volunteer for it, but can someone just say a prayer to close this time, and then we can wrap up and be out of here?
All right, I'll do it.
Thank you, Tony.
Dear Father, we thank you for this time where we can come together. Some of us only having met for the first time today, but through your Spirit and through the work of Jesus, we are brothers already. Thank you that we can share deeply and think about various topics. Lord, I pray blessings over Stephen as he prepares to enter into marriage, become a husband. And so, Lord, we just lift that up before you. And I pray that as we go out now, that your Holy Spirit would continue to guide us, show us your gospel and your truth, and what it means to be men who follow and trust you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all for listening. Hopefully this is enjoyable, and thank you all for coming out here. This was truly, truly